Okay, so picking up where we left off, the gendered political divide. So, red and blue states are, you know, more often being seen in terms of male and female issues, such as gun ownership versus gun control, aggressive military conquest versus diplomacy, um, you know, getting rid of environmental regulations versus seeing global warming as something that's, important and needs to be addressed. Um, anyway, basically, these things are becoming more so than just the partisan on a political party line, but also kind of in a gender divide as well when it comes to who supports these policies and how. So, the elections of 2008 and 2012. So, 2008 was a game changer for two reasons. I mean, it's Hillary and Barack, basically. So, with a woman and an African American vying for the Democratic nomination, it was unprecedented, right? So, characterizations of Hillary, um, were very specific versus characterizations of Sarah Palin. Something that, was kind of addressed in the makers that we watched a little bit about how they were kind of presented in the media, right? So, they had very different presentations of gender, like how they performed what it is to be a woman or what it is to be a female leader. And so it's really interesting how there was, um, even if you kind of fast forward to 2012 and you think about Barack and Mitt Romney, it's interesting how, there was this characterization of Mitt Romney as, a wimp or as weak. And a lot of it had to do with the fact that he exhibited characteristics that are kind of portrayed as feminine, such as caring about his family, which, again, that shouldn't be a bad thing. And, because of the fact he wasn't so hawkish and aggressive, he was considered to be weak in contrast, right? So, it's interesting that, you know, um, there was this kind of, gendered backlash in that own way, even when it was, again, an election past this kind of historic 2008 nomination process where a woman didn't get the nomination and, Sarah Palin did get the vice presidential nomination, but they didn't win the election. So it was kind of this unprecedented thing in 2008 to go into 2012 to see Mitt Romney still characterized in a very, effeminate way. Kind of shows doesn't even matter if women are in the race, there's a very gendered element going on in these elections. So I'm going to show you a quick clip here um, of basically some issues that are going on within our own election when it comes to gender. Something we've been talking about a bit in class.
It's great to be joined again by Jackson Katz, anti-sexist activist, author, and expert on violence, media, and masculinity. He is author of the book Man Enough: Donald Trump, Hillary Clinton, and the Politics of Presidential Masculinity. Jackson, when we think about gender and the 2016 election, most people's minds go to Hillary Clinton. We've heard allegations from Donald Trump that she's, quote, playing the woman card. I want to talk about that with you, but really, gender and masculinity in this election go way beyond Hillary Clinton being a woman, doesn't it?
Oh, yes, absolutely, David. When I set out to write this book, I was focusing on how Hillary Clinton's candidacy in 2016 was going to bring to the forefront or expose the gendered nature of American presidential politics in a fairly unprecedented way. But I, like many other people, couldn't predict that Donald Trump would then get into the race and be taken seriously by a significant percentage of the Republican electorate, to the point where gender became the central issue of the 2016 campaign. But the gender wasn't women, if you will, as represented by Hillary Clinton, but men and masculinity as represented by Donald Trump's candidacy. So I think his candidacy is all about his white manhood and his performance of a certain kind of aggressive, pugilistic white manhood. And so the debate has now shifted, I think, about the gender politics of the campaign, not just to Hillary Clinton and being a woman, and what implications that has for presidential politics in this campaign, but also how Donald Trump's masculinity and his support from a huge number of downwardly mobile white men has sort of reordered the political landscape.
Talk about that specifically. In other words, in what ways are we seeing that? Can we see it through the lens of particular issues, statements, events on the Donald Trump side?
Well, I think we can see it on that huge gender gap that Donald Trump has, even among white voters. Obviously, his candidacy has caught a wave, if you will, of interest and passionate support, not exclusively among white men, but overwhelmingly his supporters are white men, and that to me is not a coincidental feature of his popularity. It's the central feature. And if you listen to Donald Trump's supporters, if you ask them why do they support him and why do they feel so passionately about him, they say over and over again things like, he's a man, he stands up for himself, he fights back, he punches hard, he doesn't take any shit, he's got balls, he's not politically correct. It's not about his policy positions, although this stance has implications for policy questions. It's about his persona, his attitude, something that he embodies. And part of my thesis in Man Enough is that this is not a new thing in American presidential politics, that people who are voting for the president, when they're voting every 4 years, they're not just voting for a set of policy prescriptions, they're voting for a persona and a person who will embody the kind of the national manhood in a certain sense, because the president in the United States occupies a very powerful symbolic role. In addition to being the chief executive of the country, he, and it's always been he, also sort of in a sense personifies or embodies or represents literally the American manhood. In a country that sees itself as a very masculine country, the United States of America, the person who embodies that role, who plays that role, who performs that role, has a very powerful sort of symbolic hold on the popular imagination.
Does this tie into the ideas and hypotheses that what is resonating amongst many Republican primary voters of Donald Trump is the underlying authoritarianism? And this has been proposed as an answer to the question of, well, hold on a second. Donald Trump is sort of the anti-evangelical Christian. Why are evangelical Christians overwhelmingly supporting Donald Trump? And what some have pointed to is this underlying authoritarianism of Trump's ideas and policies. Does this tie into your gender and masculinity analysis in any way?
Oh, yeah, totally ties in, because authoritarianism, as it's embodied around the world in political movements, is overwhelmingly represented by male-dominant political movements. So it's hard to even separate the notion of authoritarian political governance and gender, and specifically masculinity, and the reinforcement of a certain kind of a white, in this case, white male, patriarchal power. I think one of the other key connecting points between the evangelical right and Donald Trump, although on a certain level in terms of his personal resume, you would think that they would be horrified by him, he represents the defiant reassertion of the centrality of white male authority, which is a very big part of evangelical ideology, which is the analysis of a lot of right-wing evangelicals is one of the reasons for the decline of the country, as they see it, is that men have lost control to women, heterosexuals have lost control of the agenda about sexual orientation to the gay and lesbian and bisexual and transgender movements, and parents have lost control over their kids. In other words, the way to reinscribe and go back to the way that things should be is to reinforce white male patriarchal power in the family and in the political system. And so they can overlook some of the cruder aspects of Donald Trump's serial adultery and mistreatment of women and sexual objectification of women, because in a larger sense, he embodies the white male leadership that they aspire to.
Let's talk a little bit about the Democratic primary as we've seen it. Earlier in the primary battle between Bernie Sanders and Hillary Clinton, we started seeing the early stages of attempts to cast Bernie Sanders as the guy who shouts down women and trying to introduce or cast Bernie Sanders in some way as sexist. My argument is that it did not really catch on. But talk a little bit about your observations regarding the gender dynamics within the Democratic primary a little bit.
Sure. Now, that's a very, I think, interesting development that's happened in the Bernie Sanders campaign. I think what Bernie Sanders embodies, in a certain sense, is a kind of street fighting white Jewish and ethnic Brooklyn kind of masculinity that has been missing from Democratic Party discourse for the past 40 plus years, as the Democrats have put up a candidate after candidate who is kind of cautiously centrist and corporatist, and in their personal style is very cerebral but not very pugilistic in their affect. If you look at the last several Democratic nominees, they've been very smart and talented individuals, but they haven't been at all channeling a kind of anger and aggressive kind of defiance of the rule of the billionaires or the 1%. Bernie Sanders does that. Bernie Sanders, even though he doesn't look particularly impressive in the more traditional sense of what a president is supposed to look like. And again, that's all coded with assumptions, and I appreciate that. But he does have this the persona that he fights back, and he'll take on the hard power source, the sources of power in the 1%, and make the billionaires pay their fair share. And I think that a lot of voters on the Democratic side, including a significant gender gap that he still has, Bernie Sanders, in terms of his support for more men than women, people can relate to that and resonate with that. It's very complicated, however, because he's running against a woman who is, if she's elected, going to be the first woman president of the United States, which is a phenomenally important, symbolically important, as well as in other ways important development. So irrespective of the political differences between them, him being to her left, her being much more of a centrist, moderately liberal candidate, irrespective of those differences, the gender politics are very interesting, because you could argue that Bernie Sanders has a platform, if you will, that will help women in many fundamental ways on a class level, but he hasn't been able to articulate, I think, very effectively how his analysis is broader than just a class analysis, and incorporate the centrality of the gender issues in a way that Hillary Clinton can. And even though she's not as progressive as he is on economic issues, she's the one who's constantly bringing up abortion rights and reproductive rights and pay equity issues, to the point where progressive voters who are keyed into the importance of those issues have a significant conflict.
In thinking about potential national debates between Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump, can you give us a sort of preview of the ways in which the sort of reality that Hillary Clinton is a woman and Donald Trump is a man could play out in the forefront of viewers' minds? In other words, in what ways could gender sort of take a backseat during those hypothetical potential debates that we see? And in what ways could gender come to the forefront of viewers' minds?
Well, I mean, I think if it's going to be Donald Trump versus Hillary Clinton, I think the whole election is about gender. I think it's inescapable, and it's going to come up in so many different ways, both overtly and subtextually. It's actually fascinating. If we can remove ourselves from the political implications of what would happen if Donald Trump is elected president, which I think would be a disaster for democracy. And just taking it one step removed and thinking about it in terms of just as a case study in a sort of national referendum about the state of women's advancement versus the state of the backlash against women's advancement, it's like right out of central casting, Donald Trump versus Hillary Clinton. Because Donald Trump, in addition to his other political views, and again, his racism and his bigotry is obviously an important part of his appeal to a certain sector of the white Republican electorate. He's also, the way that he talks about women, the crude way that he talks about women, the highly sexually objectifying way that he treats women and has talked about them for decades and decades. If he was elected president, in spite of all that, what a statement that would make about where we are as a society, about how important it is, how gender equality is important. Because we would be saying that if he was elected, that a majority of the voting electorate of the United States of America in 2016 has elected a man who is transparently misogynist. And it would be such a statement about how far we have to go. On the flip side, Hillary Clinton, as a woman, has to present herself not just as a woman running for president, but as somebody who's capable of leading the country, if you will. And so on foreign policy issues, where she's been criticized very strongly from her left as being hawkish, a lot of that hawkishness plays in her favor because it undermines the idea that a woman has to prove her manhood. Well, actually, it doesn't undermine that. It reinforces it. It undermines the idea that a woman is not strong, quote unquote, strong enough to be the commander in chief. Because if she's being criticized from the left for being too hawkish, that actually plays to her advantage among more moderate and centrist voters who like that aspect of her persona. So gender is all over the place in this conversation. David, one thing I want to make sure that I mention is a big part of my book, Man Enough, is about how white the, the, the Republican Party has successfully, I have to say, manipulated white lower middle class and working class men for decades now into voting against their economic interests. And my argument is that it's not just about coded racial appeals or so-called wedge issues. It's about the subtext of both race and gender. And I think that the Republican nominees over the last 35, 40 years have won a huge percentage of white male votes. And Barack Obama cut into that in 2008. He cut into the white male advantage that Republicans have had. And he was elected in a significant victory in 2008 and then reelected in 2012 with very little white male support. Remember, Barack Obama lost by 25 to 27% among white male voters. The Republicans know that in order to win a national election, they have to win an overwhelming majority of white male votes. So they have to nominate candidates who can keep up that percentage of difference because they know they're going to lose the women's vote. They know they're going to lose the people of color vote.
Right.
They have to win an overwhelming majority of white male voters. So you'll see in this coming campaign cycle all kinds of ways in which Donald Trump will be attempting to present himself. He's already been doing it, obviously, as the candidate that a quote unquote real man should support, especially a real white man. The question is, can Hillary Clinton cut into Donald Trump's support among white male voters? Because if she can, and she's doing very badly on that score in the polls right now, if she can cut into his majority among white male voters, she'll win in a landslide.
Right.
So much of the campaign is going to be about this gender and racialized gender split.
All right. The book is Man Enough, Donald Trump, Hillary Clinton, and the Politics of Presidential Masculinity. We've been speaking with the book's author, Jackson Katz. Jackson, always great to speak to you.
Likewise, David. Thank you very much.
Okay, so when it comes to politics of gender, this is just the ways various gender issues play out in the political arena. So, how did issues like sexuality, work family balance, women's reproductive rights become political? How did these become political issues? So, it's because the kind of choices and opportunities we have in our own lives can be controlled largely through the government, right? So, governments do care about gender in some ways because gender is a part of every social institution, such as the family, or work, or education. Hence, there have been a lot of laws that kind of restrict who can do what, and, even with their own bodies throughout our history. So, when it comes to fertility, for example, number of children born will affect institutions, such as education, or nowadays, since we're seeing the baby boomers move into retirement, we see issues with Social Security. But we really don't talk about this in terms of money or politics, but as a matter of religion and morality, right? When we talk about fertility. But there is a very political side to that, right? So we talked a little bit about Sandra Fluke in class, but, basically there was this hearing in Congress about women's reproductive rights that basically got a lot of attention because the panel that was making the decisions about whether or not there should be a religious exemption for coverage of birth control. That panel that would make that decision had no women on it, right? So they're basically deciding whether these private institutions have to offer reproductive options to to the women that work for them. So, Sandra Fluke, who was a law student, was excluded from testifying. She was able to do so later, but, actually because she was able to testify, she's the one with the picture here on the side. She basically became famous because she got attacked by like Rush Limbaugh and other conservatives for her testimony. Basically, she was just saying, that women need these medications to be covered and that, it shouldn't be the institution's choice. So, basically, like Rush Limbaugh basically called her a slut and suggested that if she wanted the government to pay for her birth control, then she should have to record her sex and post it online for him to see. So yeah, among other kind of attacks, that's the kind of situation that's going on when it comes to talking about fertility in front of Congress. So, the book talks about this idea like what difference is difference making. So we know men and women do have biological, hormonal, and other minor differences, which we often, again, we often overlook how similar we really are. But yeah, we do have, of course, differences. So some of this gender discrimination comes from a belief in this biological difference that leads to gender differences. So you can say, well, men are just more aggressive than women, so women should not be able to serve in the military, right? But in reality, some women are more aggressive than some men are not aggressive at all. So the military needs aggressive people, not specifically men. So often it's difficult to show that this discrimination has taken place because it's not very overt. So when it comes to sex discrimination, when you look at how the repression of the LGBTQ community is, and the fact that until recently same sex marriage was illegal, you can see how this is a clear case of sex discrimination. Because if you're a woman, you can marry a man. So why can't a woman marry a woman? Right? It just becomes a matter of who you're marrying in that case, right? So when it comes to transgender law and gender politics, this is something that's very kind of on the cutting edge right now. So, gender based discrimination is really what transgender people are facing. So, the reason that, it's considered gender based is because they're performing their chosen gender, what feels like accurate, what feels, right. And so, in this way, people have a problem with the idea that these categories aren't concrete, that someone could be born with a specific, you know, um, biological sex identity at birth, and that later in life would decide to live in the gender of the opposite sex group. So, that's their own problem. The reality is the reality. There are plenty of people that are transgender and have been. It's just that, our law and our social institutions are having, a little bit of a time trying to catch up. So, when it comes to people transitioning from one gender to another, they're subject to our ideas that people are only male or female. So, when they have these issues pop up, like what bathroom do you use, right? How do you get a passport? How do you get an ID, right? So, there was this 2011 National Transgender Discrimination Survey that was trying to understand, what kind of problems transgender community faces. And they found that 1 in 5 trans people faced housing discrimination, and more than 1 in 10 had been evicted because of their identity. So people are, not able to basically find a place to live because they're transgender. At school, trans people face discrimination and harassment. So, in the survey, 9 out of 10 transgender students reported feeling unsafe at school, facing a high prevalence of harassment, physical assault, and sexual violence, which often results in leaving or transferring schools. So, again, their education is being impacted by the fact that people cannot accept their identity, right? So, this is a problem because we know that education has everything to do with kind of your adult transition into life and success. So, if people are being bullied and threatened and harassed out of educational institutions, and they can't even find a place to live because where they live they can get kicked out and harassed, what kind of support, what kind of life are they going to have, right? So, also, um, you know there's a lot of issues that people say, well, they just have discomfort, right? They say, well, that the harassment that trans people face is normal to them because they figure that if someone has an unconventional gender performance, then that makes people uncomfortable, right? And as a whole, our society is pretty dichotomous in its understanding. So yes, people will be challenged, but at the same time, that doesn't nothing ever justifies violence, right? So, you know, obviously, if someone's performance makes people uncomfortable, that's fine, but that's the only reason that it makes them uncomfortable is because they've been socialized to believe that there's a specific gender dichotomy. So just because they believe what society has told them doesn't mean that that's what it is, right? So, trans people suffer because of this because people kind of dismiss it as, oh, well, it's just discomfort. People don't like it, right? And so this has been a lot of defense in cases of harassment and violence against trans people was, well, I was scared or uncomfortable. And that's, again, there's no justification for violence. So, an example of this, though, of just kind of how ridiculous this idea can be, is this Pan Am v. Diaz case that what they were talking about in your book, where this man was basically sued because he wanted to be a flight attendant, but he was told that a male flight attendant would make people uncomfortable. So again, this idea that, oh, well, you transgressing a gender boundary would just make us uncomfortable. So we can't do that, right? So, this is a problem because when it comes down to the reality of it, trans people don't have any federal protections in the world of work. So if people are uncomfortable with them in the workplace, then how do they work? If people are uncomfortable with them in education or uncomfortable in housing, how are they supposed to live? So there's all these bathroom bills around the country that keep popping up. And we talked about this a little bit in class. It's not as if bathrooms require anatomical parts, right? It's more of a space for a social understanding of men and women, which is what gender is, right? So, meaning that people should not have to prove what parts they have to go into what room as much as how they dress. And their social role of being a man or a woman is what determines who should use what bathroom. So, this isn't the first time in American history where we tried to segregate bathrooms. So, if we think about the last time we did that, it wasn't a great idea. And, we should learn from the history, um, when it comes to these kind of segregation policies. So, the state itself is a gendered institution. So, we're talking a lot about gender in politics and how it kind of relates to our understandings of leadership. But, politics itself, is gendered. So, not only are there these gendered issues that we talk about in the political realm, even the environment of the political world is very highly gendered. So there's this thing they were talking about in the book. I put the picture up here because I love this idea that, part of our career, the one we're supposed to set up for our future, is often during the childbearing years. So typically this is someone's later 20s, early 30s, where they have to dedicate themselves to their career, put in a lot of hours in order to get prestigious or competitive positions, such as, in professions like lawyers, professors, right? As I'm sitting here recording this when I should be sleeping. But anyway, or Netflixing, that can often, set you up for later political office if you're trying to run for things like that. So, this is a time when people kind of set up their career. But if this is the same time period that are the basic childbearing years, and we know that this culture is not, very financially accepting of, paid family leave or kind of give people concessions. We know that there's this issue, the mommy gap, as we talked about with, the financial issues. But, this is, an issue for women who want to have children. So basically, they feel like they have to largely choose career or children. So there's still many professional women who achieve career heights, but often they have to, they get to some point where they're doing well in their career and then they go, oh, whoops, I forgot to have children, right? It just sneaks up on you. TikTok. But anyway, so, gender is an identity that we all have, but in a way, you know, it's it's still a set of processes that are really embedded in the institutions and institutional logics of our society. So, as a result, a citizen in our culture is assumed to be male. So, not just because of the founding fathers said all men were created equal instead of all people, but in our minds, we see citizens as white and primarily as men. And this is just a result of socialization, right? So now globalization itself is very gendered. And, this economic integration has different impacts on women and men as there's unequal wages around the world, unequal labor force participation, and unequal control over, having control over your own body, basically. So, because these things are changing, we know the economy often affects a lot of other institutions in society. So, as a result of globalization, the definition of femininity and masculinity is shifting. So, with the spread of jobs and industries worldwide, there's a spread of dominant global masculinity, which privileges white English speaking men as the business way, like as the way like a businessman looks, right? So, resistance to this kind of gendered, racialized um, globalization is also in its own way gendered. So, you know, um, people are basically organizing to resist these kind of narratives and archetypes, but typically they're doing so in very, female dominated groups, right? So, it's interesting how when we change these economic institutions, they push back on other social institutions and kind of end up changing the definitions and meanings of masculinity and femininity. So, when it comes to colonization and gender, colonial powers nearly always use gender, both, when they would colonize a group of people, they would kind of demasculinize the men, right? So, consider the men to be inadequate in their masculinity. And they would kind of play on this helplessness or this innocence of the colonized women who are in need of rescue, right? So racism itself is sex and gendered. So through colonial struggles, white men projected their fears and anxieties onto black men, arguing that black men had untamed sexual desires that resulted in uncontrollable lust, right? So this control of black male sexuality became the responsibility of white men to protect their white women. So, lynching, for example, often included genital mutilation of black men. So, we can see how it's not as if these things are separate. This is this intersectional approach again. That when we look at racism, we have to look at the gendered or the sexual aspects of it to really understand it. So, when we talk about gender issues in the political spectrum, as political movements have formed around the world, they often have a gendered nature to them. So women were pretty active in the Arab Spring. They were active in Occupy and other recent movements such as Black Lives Matter. So while rights movements are trying to expand the role of women in society, conservative and fundamentalist movements are seeking to restore society to a traditional foundation or, trying to also seek to transform gender relations, right? But in the opposite direction than the kind of like feminist rights movements are, right? They want to go back to a time where women were more subservient. So, there's this thing that you probably hear a lot from people, this idea that the personal is political, right? So what does that mean? It just means that the daily routines of your life, such as your housework, you know, raising your kids, negotiating what activities you do with your significant other, your friends, what crap you watch on TV, what music you listen to, how you have sex, right? All of these things are kind of, these routine daily things in your lives. How we live these every day is reflected by the gender differences and gender inequality in society. So, I'll explain that in a minute. I'll dial back to that. Okay, so when it comes to the women's rights movement, since its inception, the rights movement has sought to bring about an equal status between men and women in society. So the first wave was largely associated with suffrage, or trying to give women the right to vote, but it was also trying to move women into the public sphere in other ways, right? We watched that video before to kind of went into that a little bit. And the second wave began in the 60s and really focused a lot on issues that related to gender inequality, such as fighting for equality in the world of work, education, politics, as well as dealing with sexual issues such as access to contraception and abortion, having control over your own reproduction and sexuality, and dealt with issues of violence against women, such as domestic violence, sexual assault, rape, and brought about terms such as sexual harassment, right? So it's a big movement really pushing for women's equality, right? So third wave is characterized as like the 1980s onward, and that's embraced more of this kind of intersectional, inclusive, multicultural approach to feminist issues. So basically, including poor women, including women of color, indigenous women, immigrant women, lesbians, trans women, disabled women, women of all religious creeds and national backgrounds, and as well as men, right? So, really just kind of looking at gender as an institution as well and how it also affects men. So, feminism is really the ideology that links all three of those waves together, which is the belief in the social, political, and economic equality of men and women. So there's different kinds of feminists, right? There's actually a lot more than the ones that we'll talk about here, but just to give you an idea of some different kind of main um, schools of thought within feminist theory. So there's liberal feminism, which basically these are people that think that you can change the system by voting or change it from within, right? To work with the system, get laws passed, get amendments, kind of get in the system and work from within. Radical feminism is more about fighting against patriarchy, in the kind of real world. So, fighting patriarchy in the sex trade or maybe in media representations. They believe in remaking social institutions because they believe they're built on gender inequality inside of them. So the only way to fix them is to rebuild them. And then there's multicultural feminism, where basically kind of begins where the other two left off, where they're looking at that kind of inclusiveness of the third wave, but they're taking these issues of both changing in the system and outside the system, but looking with a global lens at how these issues are affecting women everywhere. So, feminism does not mean men are not included. I know we talked about this a bit before, but it just bothers me because the reason it's feminism is because it's at least acknowledging historical inequality between men and women. But of course, feminism cares about issues against men and in no way wants to denigrate or hurt at all the rights of men, right? But there are a lot of men that don't know that or just have a kind of weird slant on what they think feminism is. So there's these anti-feminists, or as they call themselves, meninists, right? That see women's rights as an attack on men. So they don't see equality when they see these kind of things. They see it as oppression. So, they basically think that inequality is fictional because they don't experience it, right? Like if you look at like any YouTube video that's like the wage gap, you'll see like 1,000 postings of there's no such thing. It doesn't exist. Blah. And there's no obviously like fact checking those kind of things where you're like, no, but yeah, it does, right? Like, why would you make that up? Right? Like, I don't understand the logic of these people that they're like, yeah, no, it's like a global conspiracy. It's like, no, maybe just women don't have as much rights as you and you should just like not be a dick about it and also like care about their rights. Like, I really don't get it. It's so weird to me. But anyway, like all the things that they complain about that are issues that they feel like feminism isn't addressing are things literally feminism is addressing, like violence, issues of violence that men have, the kind of stereotypes and beliefs about how masculinity should be and how men should be. These media representations, right? This isn't something that we just study for women. This is something we study for men as well. So anyway, these folks don't have any fancy book learning apparently, so they don't really understand that what feminism really means. So they have this like kind of hate and anger towards feminism, and they attack women who try to seek and work for equal rights, as you would know if you're on Twitter and you post anything remotely feminist, or God forbid you retweet the wrong person, as I learned do not do. And then you have to block people for like 48 hours because they just come at you out of the woodwork with just like the stupidest 148 character logics where you're like, really? Oh, and it's just sad. It's just like a sad indictment of our culture. Anyway, thank God that's not like and the hashtag not all men, right? It's obviously not all men are subscribed to some ideology that feminism is destroying them or putting them down, right? There's plenty of pro-feminist men or men that consider themselves feminists, right? A lot of men support gender equality, and they're not threatened by women's advancement because they see them as allies, as friends, as loved ones, maybe their mom or sister, etc., meaning they see women as human beings. So they respect them and they think that they should have the same rights, right? So there's also these male advocacy groups that work to stop male violence against women. So, Jackson Katz, which I watched, I showed you guys a video clip in the beginning of the semester from him. He works, specifically in male communities to try and deal with the issues of aggression and violence that often spills out against women. And, trying to help men deal with the toxic cultural messages about masculinity that paint them as rapists and murderers and that they're unable to control their impulses, right? That really just kind of denigrate all men in this very sexist term. So, you know, this is kind of an interesting issue. It should be interesting to see if we can have a men's kind of feminist wing of this like fourth wave of the movement or something, because in large part these meninists kind of make men look bad in a way, right? It just kind of tarnishes the fact that we think we live. People argue we live in a post-feminist whatever, and it's like, well, not so much if you look at these meninist tweets I have down here, such as "Who run the world? Girls. Yeah, I'm pretty sure all the world's leaders are women. Sit the fuck down, you dumb bitch." So clearly, you can see the aggression and issues there with these meninist tweets. Rape should be legalized. Women were put on this earth to please men. They are no more than sexual objects. So these are just but a few of the horrible nightmare of these kind of like trolling, meninist, like very kind of proud, sexist, toxic people that are on Twitter that post these really inflammatory, hurtful things, again, because there's like an identity wrapped around this and this fear and this anger and this repression and this aggression towards feminism. But again, I feel like it just really comes from a misunderstanding. It comes from a place of fear. When people are afraid or they're emotional, they're not rational, right? So I feel like a lot of these meninists, if they actually like met a feminist, like talk to a person, I think they would see that, a lot of their fears are very unfounded. We're not going to castrate them or ruin their lives or something of that nature. That, when we're talking about issues that hurt men, those are important issues, and women do need to kind of take up what they can within those issues. But men and women together need to be allies on all of these kind of oppressive issues and see each other as allies instead of, enemies or other people in this dichotomous categories.